Risk Assessment, Identifying and Assessing Risk, Part 2. Risk Assessment and Risk Appetite. Assessing the relative risk for each vulnerability is accomplished via a process called risk assessment. Risk assessment assigns a risk rating or score to each specific vulnerability. While this number does not mean anything in absolute terms, it enables you to gauge the relative risk associated with each vulnerable information asset, and it facilitates the creation of comparative ratings later in the risk control process. Estimating risk is not an exact science. Thus, some practitioners use calculated values for risk estimation, whereas others rely on broader methods of estimation. The goal is to develop a repeatable method to evaluate the relative risk of each of the vulnerabilities that have been identified and added to the list. Likelihood is the overall rating of the probability that a specific vulnerability will be exploited. It is a numerical value on a defined scale. Using the information documented during the risk identification process, you can assign weighted scores based on the value of each information asset. For example, 1 to 100, low, medium, or high, and so on. Whatever rating system you employ for assigning likelihood, use professionalism, experience, and judgment to determine the rating, and use it consistently. Whenever possible, use external references for likelihood values after reviewing and adjusting them for your specific circumstances. One method of estimating risks uses the following formula. Risk is the likelihood that the threat to an asset will result in an adverse impact multiplied by the consequences or level of impact of the value of an asset as a result of a successful attack, less the percentage of risk mitigated by current controls, plus the degree of uncertainty of current knowledge of the threat asset environment. NIST Special Publication 800-30 Revision 1, Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments, recommends that vulnerabilities be assigned a likelihood rating between 0.1 low and 1.0 high. Once the probability of an attack by a threat has been evaluated, the organization will typically look at the possible outcomes or consequences of a successful attack. The consequences of an attack, most often as a loss in asset value, are of great concern to the organization in determining where to focus its protection efforts. Most commonly, organizations will create multiple scenarios to better understand the potential loss of a successful attack using a worst-case, most likely outcome approach. It is useful for organizations to retain this information as it can also be used during contingency planning. If a vulnerability is fully managed by an existing control, it can be set aside. If it is partially controlled, estimate what percentage of the vulnerability has been controlled. It is not possible to know everything about every vulnerability. The degree to which a current control can reduce risk is also subject to estimation error. Uncertainty is an estimate made by the manager using judgment and experience. Consider the following example. Asset A has an impact value of 50 and has one vulnerability which has a likelihood of 1 with no current controls. Your assumptions and data are 90% accurate. Asset B has an impact value of 100 and has 2 vulnerabilities. Vulnerability number 2 has a likelihood of 0.5 with a current control that addresses 50% of risk. Vulnerability number 3 has a likelihood of 0.1 with no current controls. your assumptions and data are 80% accurate. So the resulting rank list of ratings for the three vulnerabilities would give vulnerability 1 of asset A as 55, vulnerability 2 of asset B as 35, and vulnerability 3 of asset B as 12. Another approach to calculating risk based on likelihood is the likelihood and consequence rating from the Australian and New Zealand Risk Management Standard 4360, which uses qualitative methods of determining risk based on a threat's probability of occurrence and expected results of a successful attack. These range from level 1, which is insignificant, to level 5, which is catastrophic. Next, consequences and likelihoods are combined, enabling the organization to determine which threats represent the greatest danger to the organization's information assets. The resulting rankings can then be inserted into the TVA tables for use in risk assessment. The goal of the risk management process so far has been to identify information assets and their vulnerabilities and to rank them according to the need for protection. In preparing this list, a wealth of factual information about the assets and the threats they face is collected. Also, information about the controls that are already in place is collected. The final summarized document is the Ranked Vulnerability Risk Worksheet. This slide shows an example of a Ranked Vulnerability Risk Worksheet. This slide shows the relationship between the various worksheets used in the risk identification and assessment process. Before the organization can or should proceed, it needs to understand whether the current level of controls identified at the end of the risk assessment process results in a level of risk management it can accept. The amount of risk that remains after all current controls are implemented is residual risk. The organization may very well reach this point in the risk management process, examine the documented residual risk, and simply state, yes, we can live with that, and then document everything for the next risk management review cycle. What is difficult is the process of formalizing exactly what the organization can live with. This process is the heart of risk appetite. According to KPMG, a well-defined risk appetite should have the following characteristics. It should be reflective of strategy, including organizational objectives, business plans, and stakeholder expectations. It should be reflective of all key aspects of the business. It should acknowledge a willingness and capacity to take on risk. It should be documented as a formal risk appetite statement. It should consider the skills, resources, and technology required to manage and monitor risk exposures in the context of risk appetite. It should be inclusive of a tolerance for loss or negative events that can be reasonably quantified. It should be periodically reviewed and reconsidered with reference to evolving industry and market conditions, and it should be approved by the board. The KPMG approach to defining risk appetite involves understanding the organization's strategic objectives, defining risk profiles for each major current organizational activity and future strategic plan, and defining a risk threshold for each profile, then finally documenting the formal risk appetite statement. The risk tolerance or risk threshold works hand in glove with risk appetite as it more closely defines the range of acceptable risk for each initiative, plan, or activity. If an administrator were asked, what level of attack success and loss are you willing to accept for a particular system, the answer would provide insight into the risk threshold for that system, as well as that for the data that it stores and processes. If the answer to the question was absolutely none, The administrator would have a zero tolerance risk exposure for the system and would require the highest level of protection.